there's been a lot of talk in the past couple days, Ethan. And before we get into this, let me just put a caveat, asterisk, whatever you want to call it. Like, we put Devin Booker in the thumbnail today. That is not me or Ethan saying that the Spurs are even going to pursue going to get Devin Booker. But Mike Finger, who is a longtime columnist for the San Antonio News Express, wrote a story about how maybe that isn't the most far-fetched thing that you think. But it's not even really about Devin Booker. And we'll get into this story in just a second here, Ethan. But it's more about just the idea of the Spurs making a move for someone like a Devin Booker. The fact that that's being floated around, talked about, that's not something that's really happened. I mean, you could maybe find some little inklings in like the DeRozan era, you know what I mean? Where maybe we were like, can we make a move to try to get another star here or something like that? But really, even then, like that was never really likely in the DeRozan, DeJounte, Rudy Gay, end of LaMarcus Aldridge era. Like you and I, even if we talked about that, we didn't really think there was that much legitimacy to it. I would say since we've started doing this podcast, this is probably the most legitimate smoke, if you will, whenever it comes to just people talking about the Spurs potentially moving for a player. I just mentioned Mike Finger. It's not just that. Brian Windhorst went on the Pat McAfee show earlier this week, and he says he doesn't know necessarily who it's going to be. They were actually talking about LeBron and his potential contract. And I don't want to go too deep into that. That's a whole nother thing because Wendy came out with some other news about that today too. But aside from that, basically, Brian Windhorst just came out and said, I think at some point, like there's going to be someone out there. He said it was he suggested maybe more of a middle-aged player, not like necessarily an old player, but a player who's more, closer to their prime and knows they're a number 2 guy and realizes their situation just isn't as attractive as like playing with somebody like Victor, for example. That's what he kind of alluded to. But then the next day, Shams Charania, another very well-known basketball insider, the only person who is, you guys all know this listening, but still, for podcast purposes, the only person who has ever rivaled Woj whenever it comes to breaking news. He went on and essentially suggested the same thing, and he specifically talked about point guards. But what he also said in his answer is that basically until we make a move because of Victor being Victor and because of the point guard spot being a big need for the Spurs, we're going to be floated in basically every conversation, for potential point guards that could be on the move. And that's why you've heard stuff about Darius Garland potentially if Donovan Mitchell and him don't work out. Now, obviously, they just took a 3-2 lead against the Magic. So if they can continue to win and maybe even win a second series, that's probably going to be a little bit more out of the question. Obviously, there was the whole Trae Young thing. That's actually seemed to siphon off a little bit more. I think and this kind of ties into the Mike Finger point that we'll get into here in a little bit, but the Trae Young talk is almost more representative of the Spurs just going into that lane. Like I mentioned with Devin Booker, it's not necessarily that Trae Young or Devin Booker are realistic trade targets for the Spurs, but the fact that these players are even being talked about is a significant change in the world of Spurs fans, Ethan. I think is probably the best way that I can sum all of that up in a bow. What are your kind of overall thoughts on this? And then we'll kind of get into some of the articles.
It's weird because it's the first time, like you said, it's about to become commonplace for the Spurs to be mentioned in pretty much every trade discussion moving forward because of Victor Wembanyama. And I think there's multiple angles of this. Obviously, the NBA media is going to bring it up because Victor Wembanyama gets clicks. He's what's hot right now. So anytime someone's available, it's how would he fit next to Victor Wembanyama? Also going into that, everyone likes to start the clock on young players. Victor Wembanyama was so great his first year. It's time to kind of make moves and get competitive, right? That all makes sense. Are any of these viable or valid? I don't know. And I think we won't know until the Spurs make a move. Like the first move that they make will tell us a lot about the direction that they're going to go or the lack of move. If they don't make a move, then we know all of this is just the classic media smoke and none of it actually has any fire. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I do like what you said because it echoes what we had brought up a long time ago about the middle-aged or closer to the end of his prime second star that could sign with the Spurs in free agency. I know LeBron's name was mentioned. I don't think that will happen. Just, I mean, it's a good story, but I just don't think he's going to leave Los Angeles.
Right.
But names that I want to keep in mind that maybe we had treated with a little more skepticism prior that I'm starting to kind of open up to are Paul George, Klay Thompson, because both of those guys fit that bill of kind of toward the Paul George is more in his prime than Klay Thompson is obviously, but toward the end of their prime, um, second level players. Paul George has openly said he's the second option to Kawhi. Klay Thompson obviously is one of the greatest second options to Steph Curry. They kind of fit next to Wembanyama. Paul George has stopped negotiations with his contract extension with the Clippers, and obviously Klay Thompson's situation has been widely publicized. So those are names that I would keep a lookout on. The Trae Young thing, I have also that I was a big proponent of that move earlier, kind of toward February, March of this past season. Kind of falling off on that only because of what the Spurs said or what the report was about the Spurs. That if a trade with Atlanta was going to happen, they would rather it be for DeJounte Murray than for Trae Young, which I was a little surprised by, but I understand their angle on that. I think we all have to talk about Trae Young's deficiencies and what DeJounte would bring. Like that's all been talked about. There's no need to rehash that. But it is interesting that we're going to have to start talking about this more often because kind of where SSPN laid its foundation was like not getting into the rumor mill and trying to stay, to the facts. But this is
Right.
going to dominate Spurs discussion rooms and what everyone's discussing amongst fans for a long time until the moves are actually made.
You tied that up perfectly there at the end, and that's the thing, like why I'm trying to be clear here. Like I'm saying, yes, we put Devin Booker in the thumbnail, but it's more representative of like when was the last time a San Antonio Express news columnist wrote about the Spurs potentially trading for, a superstar level player of that caliber? And it's
Right.
been a while, and we'll get into that article right now, Ethan. So I haven't read this. I've just saw the tweet and then I wanted to save it for the episode. So we're going to go through this article here from Mike Finger, who has been, since I was like, what's the word? Conscious enough to like start following the Spurs on my own. You know what I
Right.
mean? And like looking up articles as like maybe like a preteen or something. Like Mike Finger has been working at the San Antonio Express News. So
Mm-hmm.
he is an OG when it comes to covering the Spurs.
Right.
But as you can see, here's the title: Why Suns Misery Could Make Devin Booker a Perfect Fit for the Spurs. The reasons it won't happen are obvious, so see how he starts it off,
Mm-hmm.
right? First, the mortgage billionaire who owns the Phoenix Suns probably isn't ready to concede he made the same mistake with his basketball team as so many of his in over their heads customers made with their finances. Denial can be a powerful thing. I'm honestly not sure exactly what he's referring to there, unless it's just bringing in Bradley Beal. Um, Second, Victor Wembanyama has given the Spurs the luxury of supreme patience. They don't need to mortgage anything today. They don't need to mortgage anything tomorrow. And they're certainly not going to lock themselves this summer into any deal they reasonably believe they can top in 2 or 3 years. That's a really good point. So, why then should we spend even 1 second pondering the crazy idea of San Antonio trading for Devin Booker? Because it's not as crazy as it sounds, and the fit might be better than you think. Before it can happen, though, some conditions must be met. The Suns, trailing 4-0 in their first round playoff series with Minnesota, need one more loss to complete their season long transformation from vaunted super team to dysfunctional bust. That's a that's a truthful but
Mm-hmm.
harsh way to put it. I feel bad for
Yeah.
the guys there, but it is true. He's not wrong. And we saw what happened. They ended up getting swept. Then someone in Phoenix will have to recognize that their situation is hopeless. Is that going to happen? Probably not. They're probably going to stick to it, especially with all the investment they just made.
Mm-hmm.
But it, still, with Victor, this stuff becomes much more of a reality than it was before. With more than 150 million per year committed to Booker, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal alone, the Suns have no viable way to make the team around them better. Very fair. They cannot sign free agents to anything beyond minimum salaries, and under the new collective bargaining agreement, their payroll prevents them from adding or from trading the few future draft picks they still own. So I
Mhm.
guess because they're so much over the cap, they have restrictions on draft picks they can make.
Yep.
Um, this is the dilemma second-year owner Matt Ishiba, the CEO and chairman of the United States Wholesale Mortgage, created when he sold off every movable Suns asset to add Durant and Beal. Now, there are two ways this can go. Ishiba can choose the stubborn approach and run it back with the same group that flopped this season, hoping that a coaching change and more time together can fix it. Honestly, I feel like that's probably the more likely scenario. Or he can blow it up. All that would take is Durant to get fed up, just like he did in the last place that built an ill-advised gold-plated superstar balloon around him, i.e., Brooklyn. This is where things start getting interesting. Beal's contract, which is due to pay him $57 million at the age of 33 in 3 years, is as untradeable of an NBA deal as it gets. That means the only big moves the Suns can make to trade Durant, to trade Booker, or to trade them both and commit to a rebuild. The availability of Booker is sure to at least catch the Spurs' attention because there aren't many conceivable acquirable all-stars who can offer them what Booker does. His skill set at both ends of the floor and his personality provide a dream fit with what would make Spurs with what the Spurs want a Wembanyama team to be, and he would not require them to make any major changes to their intended timeline. Booker will play next season at age 28. He signed for 4 years through age 31. His peak doesn't perfectly sync with Wembanyama's, but it doesn't need to. In a perfect world, the Spurs can draft their All-NBA point guard of the future this June, and Devin Vassell takes another big leap as Wembanyama's pick-and-roll partner, and the three of them win together for a decade while general manager Brian Wright uses his bounty of draft picks to fill in around the edges, i.e. OKC. But the Spurs got really, really lucky the first time they pulled off something like that. And when Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker did it, they started out as championship contenders. If Wembanyama's Spurs never trade for a star, it will take them years to get where Duncan began. That I do. I am a little bit, I just, what's the word? I don't necessarily disagree, but I think that with how good Victor is, like with the type of player he is, I think that could accelerate that a little bit faster. But that's besides the point. Let's just finish this out. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that approach. And again, there's no urgency to open the title window now. You wouldn't do it for a soon to be 36-year-old Durant. He says you wouldn't do it for Trae Young. I don't know if Spurs wouldn't do that, but that kind of ties into, once again, like we just talked about earlier. And I forgot to mention this too. Shams even brought that up again, that like it was confirmed. Like Shams is saying through his sources, which are probably the most reliable out there other than Woj, that the Spurs did call the Hawks and specifically asked about DeJounte Murray and not Trae Young. So I get what he's saying there, but also it's like still that the Trae Young thing ties into what we talked about earlier with Devin Booker and just a potential. I mean, I know Devin Booker's not necessarily a point guard, but he's kind of had to play that for them this year. But an all-star, guard like that, in that vein, if you will.
Right.
But for Booker, who has thrived as both a lead dog and a sidekick, wouldn't you at least have to think about it? If you have as many as 12 first-round picks in the next 7 years as the Spurs do, would you part with 3 or 4 of them for an elite shooter and playmaker who can defend and also fill in at point guard if needed? Would you do it for a guy who, on more than one occasion, has raved about his respect for both Wembanyama and Greg Popovich? I forget about the Team USA connections. For a guy who embraced his Mexican-American roots while becoming a fan favorite in Phoenix. We know how that would go in San Antonio. And then for a guy who, at the very least, would take pressure off of Wembanyama to carry the Spurs up every step of their climb from the cellar to the play-in to the playoffs to the finals. Maybe the Spurs won't. Maybe they'll opt for an upgrade that won't require as much of an investment, like a Chris Paul or a Darius Garland or even a DeJounte Murray. Maybe they'll wait for someone closer to Wembanyama's age, Cade Cunningham, ? To ask out of a bad spot. But someday they're going to be in the position to take advantage of another team's poor planning. And if a down-and-out mortgage billionaire gives them a call this summer, here's betting they at least pick up the phone. So, Ethan, I have talked throughout that whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and dish it back to you here as we get back on here. And you can just give me your thoughts and reaction to Mike Finger's piece.
Look, I love Devin Booker as a player. I think he would fit wonderfully on the team next to Victor Wembanyama. And like he finished the article with, if they called, if there was an offer, I think we have to listen to it. I think a lot of the players that we currently have are on the table. Drew King's comments funny.
I know. Appreciate you, Drew.
It was excellent reading, Jude. Where I kind of dive away from this being a possibility is two points. One, I don't think Phoenix is going to blow it up, and even if they did, I don't think Devin Booker is the guy that they're moving. I know Beal's got an untradeable contract, but that's been said before. They'd find a way to get out of that. And Kevin Durant, I think, would be the most likely to get moved. There's a lot of reasons to that. One, Devin Booker's younger. Two, he was drafted by Phoenix, so like he's the guy that they would probably want to keep around and build around. And to my knowledge, in the post game pressers, I know they've all been a little salty about getting swept, but Devin Booker's probably been the most supportive of the team in the front office from what I've seen. I don't know if you've seen something
Yeah.
different. I know Kevin Durant's complained about the way that he was utilized. I know Bradley Beal had a lot of things come out, yeah, about how he treated Frank Vogel and the disrespect by slapping his hand away, all that stuff. So I think of those three guys, he's the most likely that they will hold on to because, like Victor Wembanyama said in the comments, he holds the most value. With all that being said, to finish off again, if he was available, if they made the call, put me on record. Ethan would like to answer the phone and see at least what they would like for him.
Yeah. And that's basically Mike Finger's point here. I think the biggest line in this entire story, Ethan, is, or I'm going to read this last paragraph again, because I think it sums up what I was trying to get at from the beginning and what I think we should take away from Windhorse going on ESPN and talking about it, Shams going on ESPN and talking about it, and this column that we haven't seen in a while. And I'm here at the bottom. Mike Finger arrived at the Express News in 1999. I
Right.
mean, so he has been here through the entirety.
Mm.
He's been here through the 5 championship years, literally the beginning of it, and then also everything else that followed. So I'll just read this one more time. Maybe the Spurs won't. Maybe they'll opt for an upgrade that won't require as much of an investment like a Chris Paul or a Darius Garland or even a DeJounte Murray. Maybe they'll wait for someone closer to Wembanyama's age, Cade Cunningham, to ask out of a bad spot. Here's the sentence, though. But someday they're going to be in position to take advantage of another team's poor planning. And we are going to be significantly more attractive than
Mm-hmm.
we have been maybe ever.
Right. I think that's probably a guarantee. I just don't know if it's Devin
Even this
Booker.
offseason. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, as much as there's all this smoke about it, and Windhorst is like, I really think something's going to happen this year. It's like, with the Spurs, you never know. And with the attractiveness of next year's draft as well, we'll see how the lottery goes, and how some of those players play out. I mean, it's hard to project because as we're talking about this is more legitimate as it's ever been. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like if there is a move made this summer, that could completely, change the trajectory of all the other potential stuff I'm talking about for next year. But because of just the nature of the league, there might not be that move available until like, the trade deadline next year. I think you've talked about that before.
Right.
And maybe it could be this summer, but like we're not going to sit here and predict that. And we don't have the insider information, if we're being honest, to be like, oh, I know when there's going to be a move available. Like, we just don't know that.
Mm. You know what Henry Rosas just put in the comments is kind of an interesting thought process. I know everyone's talking about Devin Booker because of that article, but honestly, if Kevin Durant was available, I would throw some things to get Kevin Durant to replace basically Julian at that small forward spot. That would be kind of crazy. And toward the end of his career, like I know he's what 30, 36, 37.
36.
He can play till he's 40 with his play style. God forbid a horrific injury were to happen, but he can play for 4 more years.
But if you're doing that, and I guess I mean I totally get what you're saying there. But at that point, wouldn't you maybe want to just go for Paul George in free agency because
Exactly.
he's a
That's all
little bit
fair.
younger? You know what I'm saying? And when you said that earlier, like, and I'm not saying that's for sure going to happen, but if the Spurs are going, that's a thing that's like I think could be realistic. Like,
Mm,
yes, he's older, but he can immediately slot in and take the because basically we've talked about it all year. The only other person other than Victor that can consistently get their own shot on the Spurs is Devin Vassell, you know, and then
Mm,
when he's off the floor, that's a whole nother litany of things. I mean, that would really immediately Paul George coming in would probably be just the number 2 guy because he's a veteran, you know what I mean, and has
mhm.
all of that playoff experience and everything. Um, and obviously he would take a lot of the load off Victor, but when I'm looking at that, I'm like, he would take a ton of the load off Devin as well. And I
Sure.
think he's someone who could just come in and, kind of seamlessly fit at that 3 spot. Am I saying that we're going to do that? No, not necessarily.
Mm.
But these are the type of things that can come to mind now, and they're more realistic than they were before.
Not to stir the pot even more, Jude, but if you go back to 2016, 17, when Paul George was asking for a trade initially from
Mm-hmm.
Indiana, his number one team was San Antonio, I'm pretty sure. Or at least
And
top
that was
three.
because of the Kawhi connection. That's the
It
only, I
was.
guess, a little bit caveat, but still.
Even still, he has that respect for Pop. He fits the identity, defensive minded guy that became a great offensive player. And just replace Julian Champagny with Paul George in that lineup. That's pretty darn good, in my opinion.
It would definitely be a significant upgrade. And I don't think that's crazy to say.
Not at all.
But yeah, those are just some thoughts. Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything else, any other articles. No, I have some
Mhm.
other articles that we're going to get to, but whenever it comes to just the Spurs trade talk that we put in the title of today's video, I'm pretty sure that wraps it up there, Ethan.
Beautiful. Let's keep it going. Keep it moving.
Any final thoughts on it before we move on?
I wouldn't hold your breath if you're hoping for Devin Booker, but a move maybe. Anything, something.